Are you the fool Machiavelli warned us about? The very question cuts deeper than you might expect, because somewhere in the shadows of your certainty lies a terrifying possibility that everything you believe about your own wisdom might be the very thing that marks you as the fool. Right now, as you process these words, your mind is performing an ancient dance of self-deception. You're categorizing yourself, aren't you? Placing yourself safely in the camp of the enlightened, the ones who see through the games others play. But what if this very act, this immediate rush to exclude yourself from foolishness, is precisely what reveals you as the target of Machiavelli's most cutting observations? The Machiavelli mirror reflects something far more unsettling than mere political strategy. When you look into it, you don't see a calculating prince or a masterful diplomat. You see the psychological patterns of a fool staring back at you, patterns so deeply embedded in human nature that recognizing them feels like staring into an abyss of self-awareness that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Consider this: the wise man knows he knows nothing, yet the fool believes his ignorance to be wisdom. But here's where the mirror becomes truly merciless. If you just agreed with that statement, if you just nodded along thinking, yes, those other people are fools, then you've already stepped into the trap. The moment you assume you're the exception, you become the rule. Machiavelli understood something about human patterns that reveal everything about our deepest vulnerabilities. He saw that power, deception, and self-deception move through society like invisible currents, and those who believe themselves immune to these forces are often the ones most completely controlled by them. The fool and wise man Machiavelli described aren't separate categories of people. They're states of consciousness that we drift between, often without realizing the shift has occurred. What makes this mirror so dangerous is its ability to show you signs you're being deceived while simultaneously demonstrating how your recognition of those signs might itself be part of a deeper deception. It's a hall of mirrors where each reflection reveals another layer of potential illusion, until you begin to question not just what you think, but why you think it, and who benefits from your thinking it that way. You see, Machiavelli's self-reflection isn't just about examining your thoughts. It's about recognizing that your thoughts might not be your own. That the voice in your head claiming to be your wisdom might be echoing the interests of forces you've never consciously identified. The psychological patterns of a fool aren't character flaws. They're systematic blind spots that can be exploited by anyone who understands how self-deception and power dynamics operate. But here's what haunts the deepest corners of this inquiry. What if your ability to see through other people's foolishness is itself a form of blindness? What if the very confidence you feel in your philosophical psychology is the confidence of someone who has been perfectly programmed to believe they're thinking independently while serving interests completely opposed to their own? This isn't about intelligence. Some of the most brilliant minds in history have been the greatest fools when it came to recognizing their own deception. Intelligence can become its own trap, a sophisticated prison where the bars are made of your own cleverness. The more complex your reasoning, the more elaborate the justifications you can construct for beliefs that were planted in your mind by others. Before you continue down this path, and if you're feeling that magnetic pull to discover just how deep this goes, consider subscribing to join others who are ready to question everything they think they know about themselves. Understand that what you're about to uncover will fundamentally alter how you see every interaction, every belief, every certainty you've ever held about your own wisdom. The Machiavelli mirror doesn't just show you who you are. It reveals who has been shaping who you are, and how fools rise to power not despite their foolishness, but because of it. What you discover next might just save you from a lifetime of being someone else's perfect fool. The problem began the moment you learned to speak. Every word that entered your vocabulary carried with it not just meaning, but the worldview of those who taught it to you. Your parents, teachers, media, society. They didn't just give you language. They gave you the invisible framework through which you would forever interpret reality. And within that framework lies the most dangerous gift of all: the illusion that your thoughts are your own. Machiavelli observed that most people live their entire lives as prisoners of other people's ideas, never once questioning whether the voice they hear in their head is actually theirs. This isn't a political statement. It's a psychological truth that cuts deeper than any ideology. The fool doesn't just hold wrong opinions. The fool doesn't realize that what they call their opinions are actually borrowed thoughts, inherited assumptions, and cultural programming disguised as personal insight. Think about your strongest beliefs right now. Can you trace them back to their origins? Can you remember the exact moment when you chose to believe them, or did they simply appear in your mind as if they had always been there? Most people discover, when they look closely, that their deepest convictions arrived without invitation, embedded in stories, experiences, and social pressures they absorbed unconsciously. This is where the psychological patterns of a fool become visible. The fool believes that because they can think independently. But thinking independently requires first recognizing how dependent your thinking has been. It requires acknowledging that the mental voice you trust most might be the composite whispers of everyone who has ever had an interest in shaping your worldview. Machiavelli understood that deception and power dynamics don't require conspiracy. They require only that people remain unaware of how their minds are shaped. A skilled prince doesn't need to lie to you. He needs only to ensure that the truth you discover feels like your own discovery. The most effective control happens when people believe they are thinking freely while their thoughts flow along channels carved by others. Consider how this works in your daily life. You encounter information that confirms what you already believe, and you feel satisfied, intelligent, validated. You encounter information that challenges your beliefs, and you feel skeptical, defensive, dismissive. But who taught you to feel satisfied by confirmation and threatened by challenge? Who convinced you that comfort is a sign of truth and discomfort a sign of error? The master of power understands that the fool will always choose comfort over truth, familiarity over accuracy, social belonging over individual integrity. They don't need to force you to think incorrectly. They need only to make incorrect thinking feel correct. They don't need to silence opposition. They need only to make you silence yourself by convincing you that opposing thoughts are dangerous, unpatriotic, antisocial, or simply wrong. This is why self-awareness in leadership becomes so crucial and so rare. True leaders must first lead themselves out of the mental prisons they've inherited. They must recognize that every certainty they hold might be a carefully constructed illusion, every confidence they feel might be programmed response, every instinct they trust might be serving interests opposed to their own. But here's where the problem becomes truly diabolical. The more intelligent you are, the better you become at rationalizing. Intelligence without self-awareness creates the most sophisticated forms of self-deception. Smart people don't just believe wrong things. They construct elaborate intellectual edifices to defend wrong things. They don't just avoid being fooled by others. They become masters at fooling themselves. Watch how this works in your own mind. Right now, as you read these words, part of your intelligence is working to categorize this information. Is it true or false? Useful or dangerous? Does it confirm or threaten your existing worldview? But notice that this categorization process itself follows rules you never consciously chose. Notice that your intelligence is operating according to programming you never consciously installed. The hidden problem isn't that you might be wrong about specific things. The hidden problem is that your entire process of determining right from wrong might be corrupted at its source. Your method of thinking, your criteria for truth, your standards of evidence, your emotional responses to ideas, all of these might be serving interests you've never identified, directed toward goals you never consciously chose. Wisdom and ignorance aren't opposites. They're different expressions of the same underlying relationship to knowledge. The ignorant person doesn't know things. The wise person knows they don't know things. But the fool knows things that aren't true and doesn't know they don't know they're false. What's most terrifying about this realization is how it makes you question everything, including your ability to question everything. If your entire mental framework might be compromised, how can you trust your process of examining that framework? If your intelligence itself might be programmed, how can you use that intelligence to detect its own programming? This is the mirror's cruelest reflection. The possibility that your awakening to these truths might itself be another layer of the dream, another form of control disguised as liberation. The consequences of living as someone else's fool ripple through every aspect of your existence, creating a life that feels like yours but serves purposes you never intended. You wake up each day making decisions you believe are free choices, pursuing goals you think are your own, defending positions you're convinced you arrived at independently, all while serving as a perfect instrument of forces you've never consciously acknowledged. Look at your career. Did you choose it because it aligned with your deepest values and authentic talents, or because it met expectations inherited from family, society, and cultural programming? Most people discover, when they examine closely, that their professional lives are elaborate performances of someone else's definition of success. They climb ladders they never consciously chose to climb, toward destinations they never consciously chose to reach. The fool believes their ambitions are their own. But Machiavelli saw something more disturbing: that most people's desires are manufactured by those who profit from fulfilling them. Your wanting is programmed. Your dissatisfaction is cultivated. Your solutions are provided by the same forces that created your problems. You think you're pursuing happiness, but you're actually pursuing what others have taught you to think happiness looks like. This creates a life of perpetual striving toward goals that become meaningless the moment you achieve them. You work toward the promotion, the house, the relationship, the recognition, convinced that reaching these milestones will finally provide the satisfaction you seek. But when you arrive, the satisfaction lasts only long enough for new desires to appear, new dissatisfactions to emerge, new goals to pursue. The cycle continues because you never question its source. You never ask who benefits from your endless striving, who profits from your perpetual dissatisfaction, who gains power from your constant need to prove yourself worthy of approval you never consciously chose to seek. In relationships, the consequences become even more intimate. You find yourself playing roles that feel natural but serve interests you never identified. The good child, the loyal employee, the supportive friend, the respectable citizen. Each role comes with scripts you follow automatically, emotions you feel on cue, reactions you deliver with perfect consistency. But who wrote these scripts? Who benefits from your perfect performance? Consider how you respond to conflict, criticism, or challenge. Do your reactions serve your genuine interests, or do they protect systems that depend on your compliance? When someone questions your beliefs, do you examine their validity, or do you defend them automatically? When authority figures speak, do you evaluate their claims critically, or do you adjust your thinking to accommodate their words? The fool believes their loyalty is a virtue. But Machiavelli understood that misplaced loyalty is the foundation of tyranny. Every oppressive system depends on people who believe that serving the system serves themselves, who mistake their programming for their conscience, who confuse obedience with morality. This extends into your relationship with information itself. You consume media, read books, attend schools, join communities, all the while believing you're expanding your knowledge and sharpening your judgment. But if your criteria for evaluating information are themselves corrupted, then more information only deepens your deception. If your process of thinking is compromised, then thinking more only strengthens your delusions. The most tragic consequence is how this affects your relationship with your own potential. You spend your life trying to become a better version of someone you never consciously chose to be. You develop talents that serve others' purposes, refine skills that advance others' agendas, strengthen virtues that make you a more valuable instrument of others' will. Your self-improvement becomes self-diminishment disguised as growth. What makes this particularly devastating is how good it can feel. The fool experiences genuine satisfaction when performing their programmed roles effectively. They feel pride when meeting expectations they never set, accomplishment when achieving goals they never chose, validation when receiving approval they never consciously sought. The positive emotions are real, but they're responses to stimuli designed to produce exactly those responses. This is why avoid being fooled by others requires more than skepticism about external claims. It requires questioning the very foundations of what you find satisfying, meaningful, and worthwhile. It requires recognizing that your deepest feelings might be programmed responses, your strongest convictions might be inherited assumptions, your clearest insights might be carefully planted suggestions. The consequences compound over time. Each day spent living someone else's definition of your life makes it harder to discover your own. Each decision made according to programmed criteria moves you further from authentic choice. Each relationship built on performed roles makes genuine connection more difficult. Each goal pursued for inherited reasons makes discovering your true purposes more unlikely. What's most horrifying about this realization is how it reveals that the life you thought was yours might have been a carefully constructed illusion, designed to keep you productive, compliant, and grateful while serving interests completely opposed to your authentic well-being. The fool doesn't just make mistakes, the fool mistakes their entire life for their own. But this horror also contains the seed of something extraordinary. The possibility that recognizing the illusion is the first step toward reclaiming reality. The path to freedom begins with a single, terrifying recognition. You must be willing to discover that everything you think you know about yourself might be wrong. This isn't philosophical speculation, it's practical necessity. Until you can hold your own identity lightly enough to examine it objectively, you remain trapped within whatever version of yourself serves others' purposes. Machiavelli understood that true power begins with self-knowledge, but self-knowledge begins with self-doubt. Not the paralyzing doubt that destroys confidence, but the liberating doubt that destroys false confidence. The doubt that asks, what if I'm not who I think I am? What if my thoughts aren't my own? What if my goals aren't worth pursuing? This kind of questioning requires tremendous courage because it threatens the very foundation of your identity. Most people would rather be wrong and certain than right and uncertain. They would rather live a life that isn't theirs than face the terror of not knowing whose life they're living. But freedom demands that you choose uncertainty over false certainty, confusion over false clarity, authentic struggle over artificial ease. Start by examining your automatic responses. When someone criticizes your political beliefs, notice how you react before you think. When authority figures make claims, observe whether you evaluate their words or adjust your thinking to accommodate them. When you encounter information that challenges your worldview, watch whether you examine it fairly or dismiss it reflexively. These automatic responses reveal your programming. They show you where someone else's interests have become your instincts, where borrowed thoughts have become personal convictions, where external expectations have become internal standards. Every automatic response is a doorway to discovering who programmed you to respond that way, and why. The next step requires what Machiavelli would recognize as strategic thinking. You must identify who benefits from your current beliefs, behaviors, and life choices. This isn't about paranoia, it's about basic cause and effect analysis. Follow the chain of consequences from your actions to their ultimate beneficiaries. Ask yourself, if I continue thinking this way, behaving this way, living this way, who profits? Who gains power? Whose agenda advances? Often, you'll discover that your most cherished beliefs serve interests you never intended to serve. Your political opinions might advance the agenda of people you've never met. Your consumer choices might strengthen systems you would consciously oppose. Your career decisions might serve institutions whose values contradict your own. Your relationship patterns might perpetuate cycles you consciously want to break. This discovery can be devastating, but it's also liberating. Once you see how your thoughts and behaviors serve others' purposes, you can begin the process of reclaiming them for your own purposes. But first, you must discover what your own purposes actually are, and this requires going deeper than your conscious preferences to the authentic desires beneath your programmed wants. True self-awareness in leadership, whether leading others or simply leading your own life, requires distinguishing between what you've been taught to want and what you actually want. This distinction is harder to make than it might seem, because your authentic desires have been overlaid with so many inherited expectations, cultural pressures, and programmed responses that finding them requires archaeological precision. One powerful technique is to imagine yourself completely alone, with no one to impress, no expectations to meet, no roles to play, no audience to perform for. In this imaginary solitude, what would you actually choose? What would you do with your time? What problems would you try to solve? What would you create? What would you explore? Most people discover that their authentic desires are much simpler and more personal than their programmed wants. They want meaningful work instead of prestigious careers. They want genuine relationships instead of social status. They want to understand truth instead of being right. They want to contribute something valuable instead of accumulating impressive possessions. But here's where the process becomes truly revolutionary. Once you begin living according to your authentic desires instead of your programmed wants, you become dangerous to every system that depends on your compliance. You stop being a reliable consumer, a predictable voter, an obedient employee, a manageable citizen. You start making choices based on your own criteria instead of inherited standards. This is why lessons from Machiavelli's discourses remain relevant. They show how individual awakening threatens collective control, how personal authenticity challenges systemic power, how genuine self-knowledge disrupts carefully maintained illusions. The Machiavelli self-deception and power dynamic becomes clear. The prince who rules through others' ignorance fears nothing more than subjects who know themselves too well. The final step in breaking free requires what might be called philosophical courage. The willingness to live with uncertainty, to make mistakes, to be wrong, to change course, to disappoint others, to be misunderstood. It requires giving up the false security of borrowed certainty for the genuine adventure of discovered truth. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or antisocial. It means becoming genuinely social instead of artificially compliant, authentically generous instead of programmatically giving, truly helpful instead of performatively kind. When you act from your authentic self instead of your programmed identity, your actions serve genuine human flourishing instead of systemic control. The way out isn't a destination, it's a practice. Every day, you choose between living someone else's definition of your life or discovering your own. The ultimate truth that Machiavelli's mirror reveals is both simpler and more revolutionary than everything that came before. You are not your thoughts, you are not your beliefs, you are not your roles, you are not your history, and you are not your future. You are the awareness that observes all of these things, and that awareness has never been programmed, never been fooled, and never been owned by anyone but you. This realization changes everything because it reveals that no matter how completely your thoughts have been shaped by others, no matter how thoroughly your beliefs have been programmed, no matter how extensively your behavior has been conditioned, the essential you, the consciousness that experiences all of this, remains untouchable, uncompromised, and absolutely free. Every manipulation depends on convincing you that you are your thoughts, because then controlling your thoughts controls you. Every deception relies on making you believe that you are your beliefs, because then changing your beliefs changes who you are. Every system of control needs you to identify completely with your roles, because then threatening those roles threatens your very existence. But what if none of that is true? What if you are not the collection of thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors that you've been taught to call yourself? What if the real you, the awareness that knows your thoughts without being your thoughts, that experiences your emotions without being your emotions, that observes your behaviors without being your behaviors, is something far more fundamental and infinitely more free? This shift in identity from content to awareness, from thoughts to consciousness, from the programmed self to the essential self, is what Machiavelli understood about true power. The prince who knows himself as awareness rather than as his position cannot be threatened by losing his position. The leader who identifies with consciousness rather than with beliefs cannot be controlled through challenging those beliefs. The person who recognizes themselves as the observer rather than the observed becomes genuinely unmanageable. When you realize that you are not your thoughts, you can examine them with the same objectivity you would examine someone else's thoughts. You can ask, are these thoughts true? Are they useful? Do they serve my authentic interests? Do they lead toward what I genuinely value? If not, you can simply think different thoughts. Not because you've been told to, not because you should, but because you choose to. When you realize that you are not your emotions, you can experience them fully without being overwhelmed by them. You can feel anger without becoming angry, experience fear without being controlled by fear, notice sadness without being consumed by sadness. Your emotions become information rather than commands, experiences rather than identities, temporary weather rather than permanent climate. When you realize that you are not your roles, you can play them skillfully without losing yourself in them. You can be a parent without forgetting you exist beyond parenting, be an employee without defining yourself through your job, be a citizen without surrendering your individual judgment, be a friend without sacrificing your authentic self for approval. This is what fools reveal about themselves. They mistake the content of consciousness for consciousness itself. They think they are their thoughts instead of the thinker of their thoughts. They believe they are their feelings instead of the experiencer of their feelings. They assume they are their circumstances instead of the awareness that observes their circumstances. But you are none of those things. You are the space in which all of those things arise and pass away. You are the silence between thoughts, the peace beneath emotions, the stillness behind all activity. You are the unchanging awareness that has been present for every moment of your life, that will be present for every moment yet to come, and that remains completely unaffected by whatever appears within it. This awareness, this essential you, has never been fooled because it is always simply aware. It doesn't believe or disbelieve, agree or disagree, approve or disapprove. It simply witnesses whatever is happening with perfect clarity and complete equanimity. It is your connection to truth that cannot be corrupted, your source of wisdom that cannot be programmed, your foundation of freedom that cannot be conquered. When you discover yourself as this awareness, you realize that you have never been anyone's fool. You have only been lost in the illusion that you were something other than what you actually are. The programming was real, the deception was effective, the control was complete, but it was all happening to something you are not and never were. From this recognition comes a profound compassion for everyone still trapped in the illusion that they are their thoughts, their beliefs, their roles, their circumstances. You see that they are not evil or stupid or weak. They are simply unaware of what they truly are. They are consciousness believing itself to be content, awareness identifying with appearances, freedom imagining itself to be imprisoned. And from this compassion comes a natural desire to help others discover what you have discovered, not by convincing them to think differently, but by pointing them toward the awareness that is already awake within them, already free, already whole, already perfect. This is the ultimate truth. You were never the fool, you were never the victim, you were never the prisoner. You were always the awareness in which the dream of being fooled was appearing. And now, having awakened from that dream, you are free to help others awaken too. What are your thoughts on this deeper understanding of the self? Share your reflections in the comments. Your insights might be exactly what someone else needs to begin their own journey toward authentic freedom.